Hey everyone, this is the sig-auth meeting for September 13th, 2023. We have a few items on the agenda. So I guess we can get started. So let's see. James, do you want to introduce any specifics about this? Kind of talk.
Yeah, I can do a very, very brief overview. I've gone through and actually updated this now and filled out a lot more sections and a few additional user stories. So to summarize, it's kind of in two parts. One of them is including a unique identifier on every token, service account token we issue, or bound service account token that we issue. And then in order to be able to like cross-reference requests that token makes back to the token itself and its origin in the audit log. And then the second half is actually embedding user info about the user that requested the token into the token as well. So yeah, I've added a couple of user stories for it, as well as kind of some of the goals. My big specific use case myself is user story 1 here. So talking about being able to cross-reference requesting a token in a service account token presented to us by something running on a node. It's like alongside the kubelet that is then we're able to then cross-reference that token to see that it was requested by that particular kubelet that is also authenticating to us. And so by being able to do that cross-referencing, we're able to kind of anchor a trust root in the actual node's identity without having to call into the API server to see if the pod is actually meant to be running on the particular host that's connecting to this external service. I've tried to fill out as much as possible, as well as some thoughts on different types of tests that we should add to actually make sure these are in there. It's still certainly a draft. There's a few empty places here. If anyone's got any feedback, that would be great. Or if anyone's got any other similar use cases too. I've opened, that's kind of the background on it. I've tried to jot down from the last meeting some of the questions that came up and concerns so that we can kind of go over them as well. And that's kind of where it's up to. Jump back to Doc if you want to look at the questions I've got too.
Yep. Maybe before those, I was going to ask you one thing. And maybe I think it was briefly discussed in previous meetings, but maybe it was sort of lost. So just for folks' info, this is the existing Kubernetes payload. And this was like one of the proposed new parts, not necessarily matching with what you have in the KEP. But one of the things that Jordan had explicitly requested was that in addition to the requester user info that we're sort of discussing here, he had explicitly requested that just as we have a first class like pod reference, that is optional, that we would have a first class node reference, which is also optional. But I guess it depends on if it's necessarily tied with the pod one or not. But basically, I think his feeling was, which I think matches reality, is the most common use case of looking at the pod ref is to immediately look up the associated node and then do validation based off of that. And while we can get that same information if we happen to have the requesting user information, there's no reason that shouldn't just be its first class thing, because that's literally what everybody wants to do with it. Like they're related use cases. And so maybe we should specifically and just say, here's the node, here's the name, here's the UID. And it looks, basically it would reuse this type, right? It would just be, here's the name, UID. So now you immediately know the node stuff, go crazy with the node stuff.
That for like my use case 1 there, that would work perfectly well. If we've got a way, I guess we can look at the requesting user and the API server side to see if they're, system:/node to know if they're actually a node, and then embed that cross-referencing. If that's something that's possible, that solves that use case too. And if that also then means that we don't have to, if it sidesteps some of these questions we have around privacy on the including a username of the requesting user. I think that's good. As long as that the other use case on there, the JTI use case is satisfied by JTI, which I think it is, and I think it solves the problem of longer chains too, because you can technically keep chaining through at least up until you get to an entity that isn't a service account token.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that at least my feeling was that these will all be things sort of in addition to themselves. So I don't know, like, yes, I think the node ref solves the lookup problem. I think this statement right here is correct, but maybe overly strongly worded. Like, just because you have the node information, like the node name and the node UID, doesn't mean that you might not need to make further checks against the API server. So it doesn't necessarily inherently mean that it's offline. It's just that the most common lookup is skipped, right? And that lookup isn't trivial to do, right? You do basically need like a full list of all pods in the cluster to then cross-reference to full nodes, right? Like that's a decent amount of work for something that might be a common check, especially if all you needed was the node name.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think those are good. I generally agree that JTI solves most of the problems. I think my concern about just saying that it solves all of the problems is that means you do have to have like the full audit stack and keep the data for significant periods of time. And like, unless you build tooling, you would manually do the correlation. So on the full chain thing, I think we were okay saying that it would never, or at least not necessarily never. I think we were okay saying that it wouldn't be the full chain, at least to start off with. We're already limiting the size explosion by just saying groups next or just aren't there. We're just not even going to try.
I guess, yeah, I think so. The thing on the size thing, correct me if I'm wrong, how would we actually be able to assemble? Because I think one of the proposals was that we only have the initially issuing user, like either end of the chain. But I don't quite see how we would construct that without persisting all of these things. And also that that almost does raise more privacy concerns because it kind of highlights who the rootest users are, right? If you do have that chain up to the top.
Right. So I think on the privacy concerns, like I do think they're valid and we probably have to come up with some story there. I don't know if the immediate answer would be that we just don't include non-system users. Like I suspect what we'll end up having to do, depending on the feedback we get when we sort of ask people around, is probably provide an option to the API server admin to redact that information. Like, for example, depending on how things are implemented, like you could argue that UIDs are not private information. They're supposed to be gobbledygook anyway. So that's probably kind of fine. So it's really just leaves the name. So like, for example, there could be a flag that says, hey, if you have a a non-system colon username, we'll hash it before we put it in here. So it's still clear, like if you have the full list of users, you can trivially figure out which user it was basically in an offline way. But there's nothing in the token that really helps someone that doesn't know the full list of users already. But on the constructing the chain, nothing prevents us from when we get the service account, like when in the authentication layer, right? When we authenticate a service account token or an identity, right? Like we know that identity, right? And when we look at a particular service account which has a service account token which has existing, right? Nothing prevents us from keeping that within like the request context and then reusing it. So the way I would model it is probably a list and just have the first and end ones be there. But what it allows us to do in the future is if we decide that we need more than that information, that we can add more without changing the schema, because it was always just a list. Like the other thing I could see someone saying is, no, I don't understand why you preemptively truncated this list. The token still wasn't too large, and I was fine with it, but you just threw away information that I cared about. Um,
It was also like too large for who? Like too large for us or too large for the like what's the consumer think is too large?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but at the end of the day, right? Like if you're the API server admin, right, and you're configuring this thing and you're letting people use these identities against other systems, like you are in a place of privilege, right? Like you can be like, yeah, like I'm okay with these sizes because the things that I'm willing to let you integrate with are over there, and like I'll make sure they're within some bounds, right? Like it's not perfect, right? Like if I'm configuring my AKS cluster to talk with AWS, I control the AKS cluster, but I have no influence over AWS, right? Other than being a customer and being like, hey, why don't you accept my 500 kilobyte token?
Right. Like if like yeah, like if the limit was okay, if they say it was 5K or four, I think it's 4K. Like if you start bumping up against that, you as the cluster maintainer, are you going to give your customer the option to flip this flag or not? Like, are you going to just turn it on and break stuff? You kind of don't know, right?
Yeah, I think my feeling there is probably we would end up defaulting to the you get the first and the last. So it's most likely to work. Uh, and then it's up to a cloud provider if they want to let their customers tweak it further than that, because if they want to have that information. And same with the redaction stuff, right? I think all of these are API server knobs, right? So it foundationally comes down to the cloud provider. Now, I could totally see a cloud provider saying, I don't want to have to deal with this. So you're going to get the first and last, and they're going to be redacted. Right? That's certainly the safest starting point from a privacy perspective and a compatibility perspective.
So I don't think we can redact them just by hashing them, right? It's not very robust.
It In order for you to reverse the hash, you would have to have known the information that could have been present there.
Or own like 5 graphics card and have a day that I can spend just generating plausible usernames and hashing them, right? It's
Okay, sure. I mean, that's within like the limits of, yeah. So if we wanted to make it like, I mean, we could make it an HMAC, so that way you can't rainbow table it.
I mean, so like I don't know what other places do, but at Google it's like either just put the username in or replace it with a UUID, and you got to maintain a giant ass mapping table from real names to UUIDs, and then that becomes very radioactive. Nobody can touch that mapping table.
I mean, to your earlier point, is there any use case that's actually wants the requester and not the node?
I mean, I think it's sort of like a bug today, right? That like you don't have this information, right? Like if you look at our audit logs today, right, they very explicitly contain first class impersonation information because you don't want to lose that. But this can give you a mechanism where you can grant all of your own privilege to a service account and then use it to do stuff on your behalf, and you leave no trace of yourself anywhere.
Right. Yeah.
It's that's kind of broken. Uh, so I'm not saying that like a customer is asking for this, but these are not the type of things I expect customers to ask for. I do think customers might be like, well, why doesn't it? Why does it work like that? Doesn't seem sound. Um, that's the kind of things I would expect there.
What's the path here that Ahmed TD would end up in this list inside the token?
It would be you made a like you used kubectl create token as your, like you were logged in as yourself, you did kubectl create token, you got that token and then you started using that token. So today, once you started using that token, you're basically anonymous. You are that service account, but your identity is kind of wiped from the system unless you very carefully go look at audit logs. And if that service account is shared by you and someone else, at best, the audit logs tell you that one of you guys did it, but not who. So for example, if you and another person are cluster admin on an environment, we don't know which one of you did that after a certain point once the audit logs roll over.
I mean, all of this information would be pulled from audit logs, right? Whether it's JTI or, you know, the requesting username, like where.
Remember though, if it's being carried within the payload, even if your audit logs roll over, your use of that token contains that information still, enough of it to give a sense, right? But to your question, you do kubectl create token, you get a token, and then when you try to use it, it will obviously be that service account, but within that token, it will be a record that you are the one that provisioned it. Like for example, like I'll give you, like in the case of like the whole privacy thing, right? This has exactly zero privacy concerns in AKS because AKS uses UIDs for everything. Usernames are UIDs, groups are UIDs, and obviously UIDs are not UIDs, right? So there's literally nothing that's private. It's just a bunch of gobbledygook anyway. So like for us, it would be totally safe. We already do all the mapping lookups anyway.
Yeah, so I see why JTI doesn't work in that case, because like my initial kube control would not be authorized by like a token, or depending on how it's figured out, it's very likely that, you know, I don't have a token that has a JTI in it.
Right, yeah. So the JTI stuff would be purely specific to service account tokens. If you're authenticating in a different type of token that has a JTI, it's purely up to your authentication stack to contain that information and future things.
Where is the privacy concern coming from? Like, is there? I agree. Like, just thinking about what I know, which is GKE, like we just put the username in the audit log. It's an audit log.
No, the privacy concern would come up if you had some kind of flow where a user as themselves requests a token, or like something impersonates the user and then requests a token, and then uses that token against some other system. So obviously in the traditional like workload identity flow of I have a kubelet, it's got a bound service account token, volume mount and everything. None of this shows up because it's just kubelet and it's all system identities. So it's like,
Oh, okay, I see.
right? So in those cases, it's totally 100% safe. And we already have no chain of who made the pod. Like this just game over. Like whoever deployed the pod or the deployment that caused all this to happen, that is, nobody knows really, unless you very carefully piece it together.
One thought, so it makes sense to me. It's just clicked all together as well a bit more. What you're saying there about having the initial requesting like either end of the chain, because at the top of the chain is always going to be some non-service account entity. So you're going to actually, yeah, you're going to be able to, yeah, it will almost always be pretty much, yeah, should be, unless there's a JTI, like you say. No, sorry, forget what I'm saying. The first one in the list will be a non-service account entity, presumably. And at the end is kind of like the previous requesting user. That helps you because someone can't request one to request one to request one to request one. But you just also, I've just thought about one other thing we need to consider is impersonation there. Because if I, as a user, because it's really nice that property, like you say, that this lasts longer than the audit log. But if I can impersonate a user who can then create a token, we do actually lose the impersonation, like unless we're also going to embed who was originally impersonating.
That's a fair point. You lose impersonation information without the audit log present.
Yeah, and that's only because if we're trying to solve, and I think it's a good case to solve for because it has actually just raised some alarm bells.
We have to solve for that because
yeah, we do.
Because edit level access in a namespace lets you impersonate any service account in that namespace. So it'd be very trivial
Oh, you just impersonate that and then go on.
Yeah, it'd be very trivial to redact yourself out of the log. So I think we
Yeah.
have to solve that somehow, which is unfortunate.
You just said that what is living longer than the audit log here?
The token.
Don't tokens live for like 12 hours?
I mean, you can
Up
ask
to a year.
you can ask for a token that lasts forever.
I think the API server actually caps you out at 1 year. We have a KubeCon talk that's going to talk on some of this because we're going through it. For the bound service account tokens, I think the maximum.
I thought we just let you have it for like max in 32, unless configured on the API server.
For bound tokens, they had a max age, which I think the maximum you can set the max age to is 1 year.
Okay. Either way, a year is way
Yeah.
too long for any like sane security person.
But going back to I think the original question.
But to your last point though, I'm not even sure how we would solve this impersonation thing, because if I make a service account token for a service account, and then I impersonate with it to make another service account token, like I feel like if I just do enough hops, I'll
Not if you actually include the impersonating, like that top level impersonating user as the first entry in that list, right? Because then the second entry, who you're impersonating, gets thrown away, and then that the rest of the chain. But ultimately, the very first one is there, unless you impersonate and impersonate to impersonate. Is that what you're saying?
you can't nest impersonation today.
Okay. So if you always include the actual user making the impersonation request on that, like I think the very first request, I'm impersonating someone and creating a bound token, that context is available to us at the point we issue that token, right? Who the top level, the first real user is. If we actually put that as basically it kind of changes the rules of what we put in there, because instead of putting the actual requesting user, we're putting the requesting user or whoever is impersonating them as that information. So it's like the origin user.
Like I know what you're saying. I just can't convince myself there isn't an edge we end up missing. I'd have to like write it. I have to go like write some code and see like what the output is and see if it makes sense.
So, like to go back to the question, I think that a while back, like, are there use cases that the node thing doesn't solve? Like, I think there obviously, yes, there are, which is exactly what we're talking about here. For what originally set me down this path, a node-based like a node field in there solves kind of like my initial user story one. But I think you're right in saying that there is definitely something to be desired for. Like, it's highlighted to me how easy it is to actually hide your tracks in the audit logs today, as it is just through bound service accounts. And I do think that's a problem.
Yeah, basically, the more malicious you are, the easier the system falls to you.
I wonder if there's an element, maybe. So in here, I think the node stuff seems like we're broadly agreeing on, and JTI. JTI, I think, is something we should be doing. It's not perfect at all because it does require the audit log to be retained. I wonder how do we retain this like actual end-to-end capability to check through this? Maybe that is actually a separate thing, because right now, as it is, like, you need to maintain your audit log in order to see. I think we're in a net better position without adding any features that we don't want. I think unless we can come up with a solution to this kind of like end of the chain impersonation thing, maybe there'll be others with more ideas on it. It feels like it should work. If maybe we need to write those unit tests that you're talking about and write some code. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but are you asking the question, should we include this in this cap at all?
Yeah, I'm wondering if maybe we should do the JTI and then a node entry, and then we should actually possibly even field some more like feedback on like who, like, are the current things sufficient, and what do we want to provide with kind of that end-to-end thing, because there's an argument to be said, it's actually useful to include that impersonating user along the way as well and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I can find that. Also, one thing that wasn't 100% clear on the node ref part was if the expectation would be that the node ref is pulled from like I guess the node ref can't be. The gist was that because we would expect it to include UID, is that you would use the API servers like Node Informer
Yeah.
actually fetches. So that's not wired up today, but it wouldn't be hard to wire it through.
Yeah. This is all in the API server as well, right? So it's from a local.
Yeah, there's no performance impact.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I did notice that wasn't in there. So that's at the time made implementing requesting user far simpler. But it does actually, you were right in saying that we then have to do some kind of a mapping from requesting username back to node like anything simple, like we can do that by stripping bits off, but there is still some mapping going on. So it is quite neat to have.
Yeah, I mean, if the thing that everybody does involves the node, we should just give you the node. Yeah, I mean, I guess from this conversation, like, I mean, I wish like David or Michael or Jordan was here so they could be like, I want this or I don't want this. My gut says that maybe it's just okay to limit this to a first class node ref and I guess JTI is already first class in JOTS, but like just include that in there. And just maybe scope the KEP. Like, yes, it would be a non-goal, but it might make more sense to state it as like deferred goals and basically just say, whoa, we couldn't figure out how to make impersonation and everything else work with a chain.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think today actually having JTI brings some significant improvements for people, like especially if you're aware, like you could actually say, well, you know what, token request audit logs we're going to retain for even longer, specifically so that we can do this cross-referencing back. That does provide meaningful benefits on that front too.
Right, and it's a very small change.
And it is a small, like this proposal is quite simple if you replace the node bit with that bit and go with JTI.
Yeah. So if I go back to my PR, if I can remember, so let's see. So we would have JTI, like just like this. We would not have this part. Instead, we would have a new thing that looks exactly like this, which would be like node.
Yeah.
And it would be like, it would be name and UID and just the name and UID of the node. And then
would we be open to adding any additional fields, or would we want to try to keep it the same as everything else?
My feeling is it would stay exactly like this. The reason we include this is because these are immutable. They're permanent aspects and fully generic aspects. So I think that is a much longer ask if you want to start including other parts of the metadata, and I would just prefer to not try that conversation right now. And I guess if you really need that information, I feel like having a node informer is much less work than having all your pods with back references to nodes. It's like at least half the work. So I don't think including JTI is controversial and extra. If we include pod UIDs in extra, so I would expect us to include node name and UIDs in extra. So because that would be consistent. But that removes a lot of the questions around. But basically, there is no privacy concern. So I guess let me go back to your thing. So like, yes, I think we all say JTI is awesome. We should have just done that from the beginning. I'm not sure why we didn't. We can ignore this question by saying maybe we just don't include requesters today. We can also ignore this question by saying we don't include requester. Same here. And then in the previous discussion about this, what did we say? This question is not a concern because we're not having user information. Yeah. Yeah, I guess if we were leaning, I see David's on the call. David, how long have you been here?
Literally just joined.
Okay. But you said you would be 10 minutes late.
It turns out the listing of my faults as a software developer took longer than I anticipated.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, so I don't know where Mike is, and then Jordan is at the doctor, so it's just you. So I guess I'd fill you in. I'd meant to cap this conversation, but we couldn't really have any of the other conversations without somebody other than like me on the call. So we were talking about the enhancements to bound service account tokens and all the stuff. And the proposal that James was making, which I generally felt like was kind of okay, was what if we limit the changes for now to include the JTI stuff that shows up in audit logs and user info, and to add a first class node reference, which also shows up in audit logs and user info, and just stop there for right now. And basically we will prevent the concerns around token size, token privacy, and we weren't sure how to make the chain work exactly correctly with impersonation in the mix. Like if you impersonate a service account to make another token to then do some other stuff, I feel like the chain is going to get really wonky.
Okay. A first class field for the node, you say?
Yes. So basically today, this is the struct we have, minus line 57. That line doesn't exist. And we would basically add another line that's just literally node and it points to this thing. And you would get.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And we would, I guess, use the node informer on the API server side when we see the node user to go ahead and like if we see the username is the node, we'll go look it up and put it in there
and verify. Oh, we would automatically put it in.
Yeah, we would automatically put it in, and I guess we could do verification if we wanted to. I mean, the node authorizer is already doing a certain
If
amount.
we were to fill it in that way, how is it distinct from, how does it provide unique information compared to just seeing a kubelet identity?
So the reason for doing it that way was that we would not include this at all for now. We would not.
Oh, I see. To eliminate all the concerns about. I see.
Yeah. And also, like the concerns, yes, but I'm a little confused right now, and I'm not 100% sure we could reasonably implement that list in a way of the list of requesting users in a way that wasn't like vulnerable to someone being clever with impersonation.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect us to be able to.
Right. So like, if the point of the list is to be like a really good, useful list that like tells you like who was messing around, but if an evil actor can just mess around extra well and it doesn't show up, it doesn't seem like it does what I want yet. So like I wasn't sure how to solve it, and I felt like it probably was better to just have a smaller kept with things that basically none of us disagreed with, and it would just be easy to make the changes.
Yeah, I'm thinking. So that sounds. Huh. And so that would mean then what would we expect if a node went away? If a node went away, we would say people, when they looked up the node, would find out the node wasn't there and would be expected to not honor the token. Get to choose whether to honor the token.
So I think maybe you could maybe we could reframe that question to say, if I took one of these tokens that had this new information and I passed it to token review and the node doesn't exist anymore, what do you expect token review to do? I think I would expect it to reject the token.
Okay, so that's even different than what requester info would allow you to do, right? So requester info with that information would come in, you would see a kubelet identity, and the token review would be unable to decide, well, did this belong to the previous kubelet or the current kubelet? And so is this actually even closer to what you want to have happen? And if so, then I would actually say that sounds quite reasonable. I like that.
Yeah, I think the reason we include UIDs in these things is because when you delete and recreate the same name, it's not the same thing anymore, at least as far as auth is concerned. And so I would expect the deletion of a node object to invalidate all the tokens that were issued for service
It's-
account.
Critically, does James agree with you?
Well, so that sounds good. The one thing that it sounds like a very clean design. But if I've got a set of pods running on a node and I delete the node object and then restart the kubelet talks to the CRI, it's going to go and recreate its node object. What happens? Does it resync and my workloads keep running? Because we're now changing the behavior there, right? Like that's all of a sudden a token that was valid is no longer valid. Like what happens today if I've got pods running, I delete the node object, restart the kubelet? Could my workloads continue to use their tokens to authenticate? Because we're about to break that.
Yeah, so today I think it would keep working.
Like my workloads wouldn't be stopped, would they? They would continue running and the kubelet, I think, would adopt them. I might be wrong.
I bet that depends on how you end up bringing it back, right? Like on whether it was I've rebooted the node.
Or just restarting the kubelet would trigger the node object to be recreated. I wouldn't do
When
anything.
you say restarting the kubelet here, I think you're saying the node process turns on and off, right? You're not saying literally the VM turns on and off, because obviously
I'm
Right,
not doing VMs here at all. Kubelet process, like system CTL, restart kubelet.
Okay.
Restarts it, and on
Right.
startup it creates a node.
I think if it just restarts in place, it's maybe even like does the it wouldn't invalidate the token unless you got a new node, right? Like a new node resource on the API. I think that's what we're saying.
Yeah, basically by deleting that node object.
So you need it to be you need kubelet to be down and the node object to get deleted, which in practice is if the node is so unhealthy that like 5 minutes or so go by without a heartbeat, right?
Don't think the node. Yeah.
Like then node controller deletes it. I mean, a person could also delete it.
What I'm concerned about is, say, like an SRE who's quite used to being able to I don't know if it's possible today, but like if an SRE assumes that it's possible to non-disruptively, like to the workload, delete a node object in the API server and issue a system CTL restart, when it could, like, do they expect to be able to do that non-disruptively to workloads today? I think.
Yeah, I think that would work okay today.
I might go and mess around with my cluster site over there and find out. But
I would fully expect it to work today because we're just unaware of that information.
Yeah, I think it's fine today.
Well, actually, let me take that back. We're aware of the information. We just verify it differently.
We don't use it, right? So
yeah. And then I suppose that's possibly something we can do. I'm just conscious of the whole breaking changes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one way to make it less breaking is like when the kubelet starts up and it's going to adopt these pre-running pods or whatever the term is, because I know almost nothing about the kubelet code. It has to figure out by looking at the volume mounts, like when it's supposed to refresh stuff, right? Like it's supposed to know that, right? So one of the things that should be able to do is be like, hey, is the UIDs of the nodes that were used to issue this token my UID, somebody else's UID? Because if it's not mine, I have to reissue the tokens.
Yeah.
But even if kubelet reissues the tokens, you have to wait for the timers in each workload's client to catch up. So I don't know that that's non-disruptive.
And there's still a period of time. There's still, like, from the moment you press delete on the node object previously, everything would be fine to authenticate still. Now it's not. So I think we can do that, which helps mitigate it because it reduces that window. Oh, it makes it automatic. It self-heals. But yeah,
It is still a noteworthy change. I'm glad you called that out. I don't know. I would have thought of that immediately.
Yeah, I mean, in my head, I'm like, you delete the node object, I expect these tokens to stop working, but at the same time, I'm like,
I would go ahead and enumerate that in the notes so that we can make a note when we review it to decide, do we actually want that or not?
yeah.
I can see an argument both ways. I think I'm probably more sympathetic to deleting the node object. Huh. Yeah, I don't.
then so
I could definitely see this one both ways. Actually, Micah, what would you expect it to do? You run a bunch of clusters.
Yeah. What happens in AWS land?
Well, what would you expect it to do when you say, like, I deleted this node, the node object?
I mean, I would not want a token to validate. Like the pod should already be gone, right?
So we're just saying that like the kubelet process restarts without the containers restarting. And because of that, it's forced either deliberately or accidentally the node object.
Someone has to explicitly delete it. When the kubelet restarts, it does not delete its node object.
Yeah.
Right.
yeah.
Right.
But
I think that's like the ideal thing from a security perspective, but I don't know. I've seen enough weird cases in GKE where like James pointed out, like an SRE is just doing this thing and it's a workflow they figured out works, even if it's like not really the best way to do something. And we will get tickets for that when we break it. Sometimes it's usually not catastrophically disruptive, but sometimes it is. And I've seen enough of them to worry about breaking something like that.
But a node restart doesn't delete the node.
no, it could be a debug step though.
It would be a weird workflow, like no doubt, right? I mean, usually the reason a node gets deleted is because the VM's been deleted and it hasn't heartbeated, or it's just so unhealthy that it needs to be repaired. And node controller does the right thing and goes and deletes the node, and that's the only reason a node gets deleted. But I don't think we can rule out human or scripted workflows that might be messing with it.
Yeah.
I will certainly ask some of our SREs internally exactly this question. So hopefully we can help.
But we already checked that the pod is a lot like exists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We do
So-
for pod and for
secret.
Secret. I think
So
for
what
as well.
like what case would the node not exist but the pod would?
If I sit and do a kubectl delete node on my cluster running right now, the pods on there will continue to run because we don't tear down running pods when we delete the node object. There's no like owner reference relationship or anything between node and pod.
I guess one reason the node might not exist is if you're like, huh, this node is compromised. I'm going to delete it now and like start
That's
removing
very
it
valid.
from my cluster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you try to quarantine it and then do forensics on the VM, that might be part of that workflow.
So I definitely don't want the tokens to keep working after the fact.
That kind of goes back into my, and if we go down that whole route, my original use case here of being able to do offline validation is now actually sort of invalidated because I guess I'd have to watch node objects to do a similar sort of level of protection.
But again, though, if you're doing offline validation of any Kubernetes service account token artifact,
But it's
you
expired.
decide the level of verification that you care about because
Yeah.
we can't control if you do token review or not. Certainly,
Yeah.
we can recommend it because it's guaranteed to keep up with our latest guidelines. But today, the most common thing I see people do is like, does the signature validate? Cool. Is the subject vaguely look like the subject I expected? Cool. That's good enough. Here's your cloud identity. They're not checking the pod. They're not checking. They're not doing any of the realistic checks half the time.
And actually, that is a good call out. We could well call back in to the token review API, and that's far cheaper than what we've talked. It's not offline, but it's far cheaper than us having to maintain a cacheable pods and node. So that's something I could take away on my side.
Yeah.
All right, so I think it's going to be a behavior question, Mo. If the desire is to actually expire these when the node gets deleted, which I could see as reasonable, then adding the node field makes a lot of sense. If that doesn't actually do what we need it to do, then having a user that we restrict to, we only fill this information in when it is a kubelet, because we can recognize what those look like. That could be narrow enough for people to be comfortable doing. Saying that
There's a middle choice too, right? You could still have the first class node ref, but not verify it.
I don't think I like that. I think that on the call, everyone here looked and said, if it's in there, I would expect it to be validated.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. If there is a first class field with a Kubernetes specific meaning, like service account and secret and pod, those do get validated with every 10 seconds, basically, because that's the token cache. Yeah, so okay, I can see where you're coming from. So either we include it as a first class thing and we validate it in the same way that we validate other existing references that are first class, or we include it as like this opaque requester, and the validation is up to whoever is consuming the token, and the API server doesn't know or care, just opaque strings. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay. I really hope then that we can include it as a node ref, because then I don't have to answer all these questions about requester info that come up once.
Sure.
Yep. Okay, cool. I don't think we have much time to discuss anything else. I guess, James, do you have anything else you want to ask about this?
No, that sounds good. Do I go ahead and update the KEP with talking about adding a node field, and then in alternatives considered, maybe talk about some of the requester info stuff and say that this is something that we want to explore as a separate set of goals in order to make sure we can do that securely. And then possibly touch on this token review stuff so we can discuss how we want to enable that, I don't know if we can do that tomorrow or what. Yeah, sorry, by tomorrow I mean the next release, all in one go, or whether we need to actually have like a gradual tightening of that behavior, which maybe Jordan will have some more input on too.
I mean, any of this would be behind a feature flag, right?
Yeah, definitely. I guess whether just that feature flag alone on its own is sufficient for tightening. That makes sense, to be fair. So yeah, cool. No more questions. Thank you for this 15 minutes that you promised me at the start of the meeting.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, nobody was here but us, so I was like, we can't really talk about the split. David, you weren't here for the last conversation around the split, right?
Which split?
Sorry, the secret CSI controller split. I guess so. Jordan was here.
You still want to do that one then, huh?
Yes, we do want to do that. So I guess I'll just ask the very specific sig-auth question. So Jordan was supportive. Are you supportive of there being a new sig-auth subproject that is the controller?
The controller that does the external secret injection thing?
Yeah, so it gets secrets from whatever provider and then puts them in Kubernetes. Remember,
yeah, I could
see
accidentally
exists in the system. Sorry, go ahead. I interrupted you.
As a separate project, sure.
Okay. Cool. The gist for, I think some of the folks on the call were on that last discussion, is we were trying to add offline support to Secret CSI. After discussing it with the folks that wanted that and all of those things, we basically came to the conclusion that those people just want Kubernetes secrets anyway. So the high level plan is split the projects in two and then rip out the secret sync feature from Secret Store CSI. Obviously over some period.
Yeah, I'm happy with that.
Yeah, so that we have the secure way of doing this, which is Secret CSI, and the less secure way of doing this, which is the controller.
Yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable.
Yeah. So then you can have your security if you want it, and if you don't care or you have a different boundary, use the controller. Okay, cool. I think we'll bring this up next time to discuss in a bit more detail because there's a relatively long design doc. I'll just move basically everything up to the next meeting's agenda. All right, cool. Thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much. Bye.